Well, thanks very much for having me. I got the time wrong. Adam rang me up. It's like, oh shit, I've got 5 minutes to be on, so I'm glad you're running a little bit behind, and then IT difficulties as usual. But we got there, so yeah, pleasure to be here. I'm in between camping trips at the minute, so brought on last minute, but super excited to be here and share some of my ideas with you, which is what I'm going to do today. We've got a lot to pack into a half an hour, little section, but I'm around for the rest of the afternoon if you want to come in and chat about some of the ideas. So I always start with a little bit of my backstory because I think it's really important to situate what we do as a product of our experiences. You know, we work with parents, athletes, coaches. The first thing I always do is sit with them and say, hey, like, where have you come from? What are your experiences and how have they impacted who you are today? Because I think it's really important. So this is me as a 14-year-old playing first 11 football at Mags, just here in Mount Albert. This is where I grew up. And so sport's been a massive part of my life. I went to school to play sport and eat lunch. And I was just lucky that I was able to do my academics and pass. This is also a big part of my life. This is my wife Anna. So she played professional netball for just over 20 years. She recently came out of retirement to play for the Stars for 2 years, and then took a hiatus for 3 years where we travelled the world on the 85 VB World Tour, which is interesting because that experience I am estimating is very much like tennis on the world stage. So we were travelling from tournament to tournament to tournament. In the first year trying to make a main draw, and then eventually making a few main draws and having that experience. But yeah, so super interesting, and a lot of my learnings, even though I've spent 9.5 years in tertiary education, is actually sitting on the couch with Anna talking about her experiences. So sometimes she'd come in the door full of joy and share those experiences, other times she'd be highly frustrated, pissed off with the environment and the people that were within it. So lots of my experience and what I share is a product of not only my study but also the people that I spend time with. These are my kids. So working with young people is really personal, and it's becoming more and more so. So Isaac plays football. Georgia in the middle there is a budding netballer. She just wants to be like her mum. And so we're starting to experience lots of the joys of youth sport, and we all know that it's changed massively over the last generation or so. So I started out in high performance as a sports scientist, came out of my master's degree and worked as a strength and conditioning coach in netball and in cricket. But what I saw was that over time we were getting athletes through the system that I perceived had gaps in their development. So I was working around the physical game, but I was also seeing emotional, psychological gaps that I thought if we had intervened earlier, then we really could have made a difference. So I went back to some colleagues at AUT and I said, hey, I'm interested in looking at other options, and 2 weeks later I got an email with a PhD offer. That PhD was to obviously do some research, but it was also to run an LTAD program out at AUT Millennium. So that was one of the first programs not only in New Zealand but in around the world. We took the methodology from Bali, this researcher out of Canada, and we applied it over, started in 2004, I picked it up in 2010, and I was there for a decade. When I walked into that program, it was very much just a physical program. We were looking at what we could do to elevate the physical gains of kids between the ages of 8 and 18 across many different sports. But over time, from what we saw, it needed to be more than that. It needed to be a truly holistic developmental experience. So I went on a massive journey, did a lot of my own PD around social, emotional, developmental stages alongside the physical stuff. And so a lot of my lenses that I wear when it comes to development have got all of those aspects to them. So the first question I have today is like skill versus fitness, because this is one of the questions that I come across all of the time, because I think they're different and we're going to be really clear at what we're trying to do. So movement is a skill, and I'm going to talk to you mainly about skill in the context of movement today. Now fitness is different, so I think about skill as a brain-body connection. I think about fitness as the physiological adaptations that we need in order to play the game better. So fitness is strength, it's speed, it's power, it's these types of adaptations that we need, but it's separate to the skill of movement. And I think it's really important that we differentiate those two when we're helping young players to develop. So most of the context today is around the skill of movement. So what I thought I'd do is share some of the backyard experiences from my kids over the last few weeks just in the outdoors, because a lot of the skills that we can pick up and that we used to pick up, which I think has regressed over the last decade or two, is the skill of movement just by spending time moving in relatively free environments. So what I want to draw your attention to here is actually the skill of what Benjamin is trying to do as he moves across the rocks, and what are the different components that he's having to pay attention to as he does this. So this is Georgia and her friend walking across a tree in the forest about 10 days ago. This was about 3 or 4 meters off the ground and relatively narrow, you can't see it there. But there's skill in this, and it's a really holistic activity. Jumping off rocks. So this is what we all used to do growing up in the outdoors. So there's a lot of aspects that come into successfully making this happen. So one of the things we know about movement is that the skill of movement is around predicting what's about to happen. And this shows up in tennis all of the time as well. So movement as a skill and tennis as a skill coincide hugely, and you can apply a lot of your skill acquisition elements that you do in the game to movement. It's just a different context. So this is Isaac here jumping off the side of a pool, having to judge his space, having to navigate other people, and having to land in a way that is successful and also free of injury. Georgia running down a really steep sand dune out of Muriwai Beach, which is our local beach. We live about 10 minutes away. Now there's a couple of elements here I want you to draw your attention to. Obviously coordinating the movement, but there's a fitness element here too. Every time she hits the ground, those muscles are having to elongate and eccentrically work in order to control that movement. And that's what we get when we spend a lot of time running down hills in nature. Really important when you're trying to change direction on the court. So that ability to eccentrically control as the muscle lengthens is something that kids pick up in the outdoors, or at least they used to. So we don't have to necessarily work on it so much in the game, although that's where we are now. Okay, so what do great movers do? They predict space, right? So be it jumping into a pool, running down a sand dune, or playing tennis, great movers are really good at predicting the space that they're about to move into. I can send you all the stuff if you need it. They're really good at predicting gravity. So we're always working under this idea of gravity. So as a general rule, great movers are really good at predicting gravity. So as Georgia's running down the hill, she has a really good ability to predict the foot and what the different joints have to do in order to handle that gravity. And running down the hill at a relatively fast rate is about 5 to 7 times body weight that she's having to control, which is huge, right? So Georgia's about 35 kgs. If we times that by 5, that's like having 150 kgs on a back squat. They're really good at predicting others. So they know where other people are in the game. Obviously tennis is a little bit different to that. It's not an invasion sport, so we don't see as much of it. But they have to predict what's happening on the other side of the net in order to move in a way that's going to be successful. And they have to predict objects, in your case it's the pool. Okay, so I work with beach volleyball, and so we can see all of these things, predicting space, predicting gravity, predicting others, and predicting objects in this New Zealand Day beach volleyball program. So movement underlies the specific skills of the game regardless of the sport. So predicting space, where he's going to land, what type of surface he's going to land onto. predicting gravity. So the body needs to know what to do in order to slow down as he hits the sand in order to get ready for the next movement. Same idea here. Predicting space, predicting gravity, predicting the object, and obviously the other in this case is the coach. Okay, so those are the general principles that underpin what great movers can do. Okay, so then we take that to a youth environment and we ask a 14-year-old female to stand up on a box, and all of a sudden some of these things start to dissipate. So the ability to handle gravity, we can see that she's struggling with. Obviously I'm slowing her down in order to make things harder. We can use speed as a variable. So to do this faster is easier, to slow it down is harder. We want to explore speed as a variable when it comes to movement. So this was a young girl that came up to see us a few years ago now at ASB Millennium. She had been having chronic back pain, so I work a lot around injuries because movement fundamentally is at the core of that. Chronic back pain, was a triathlete, really big load, couldn't get rid of this pain, and eventually couldn't compete in her sport because of this. Now you can see that as she runs, you wouldn't see that so much with the naked eye in terms of the inefficiency in her ability to predict gravity safely. But when we move on to a single leg squat jump, we can see that the knee is collapsing in and the hip's not doing a lot of stability. So we can look at that as a physiological deficiency in terms of her strength, but we can also, and we need to, think about that as a skill deficiency in her ability to predict where her foot and her body needs to be as she hits the ground. Those are two different things, and we work on them in two different ways. We need both. Most of the time, we only think about the physiological stuff. We're not so interested in the skill when it comes to movement, which I think we need to be better at. Just as a caveat, so I spend a lot of time thinking about biology. We do research in biology and what happens as the young athlete transitions those developmental stages. And we did some research in cricket, and Cricket New Zealand came to us and they said, we think we've got a bias in our selection criteria around our young teams. So we went into a camp here in Auckland and we measured biological maturation, which we can do through some nice science. And we found out that in fact they did. So this was their under 14 side. All of these boys are 13. So you've probably seen this in the spaces that you work in. And this is important because it impacts talent and the way we select it, but it also impacts the way that young people react to movement. So we really, if we're working with this age, or the stage of development, we really need to understand the effect of biology. So I refer to it as the baby giraffe effect. And as kids navigate that accelerated growth period, which sits around puberty, it's almost like they're having to rediscover how to move. So we know that kids go through this accelerated growth spurt. On average for boys it's about 13 where they hit their peak accelerated growth phase. For girls it's about 18 months earlier, about 12 and a half. These are just general averages when it comes to young people. Obviously they're all on their own scale based on individuality. We also know that there's a plus or minus 5 years range when it comes to this accelerated growth phase. So we can have a 16 and a 10-year-old going through the same stage of accelerated growth. Really important to take note of. There's some research out of the English Football Academy in the UK that looked at SEBAs and Oxford Schlatters, which I'm sure you've seen before, probably sending kids off to see physios because they've got sore ankles, sore knees, sore backs, and these are chronic growth injuries that happen with accelerated growth. You can see in boys that it kind of correlates with that fastest rate of growth. Okay, so I was watching the World Cup and just watching this young lady move. So we know that if we don't deal with it in development, then it can show up in high performance. Now, all I'm interested in is the alignment of your foot, knee, and hip. Now, from an injury point of view, we know that her ability to predict space and control that lower limb could be better. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to get injured, but it is a risk factor for injury, and it's also a risk factor for producing force in a way that's optimal. Okay, so what does skill movement, where does it come from? So this is the traditional point of view. So we ask young people to squat and lunge and push and pull, and there's value in this, but this more aligns to the fitness side of development. So we know that we can increase the strength in quadriceps and hamstrings and gluteus, maximus and medius and gastrocs, the calf. All of these muscles are going to benefit from doing some squatting. And we also know that we can teach this movement really explicitly by asking someone to stand in that position and instructing them using very explicit cues. But what we end up getting is someone that can move really well in squatting, but doesn't necessarily have the ability to predict space, to predict others, and to predict gravity on the court. So we need this, but we also need the other stuff. So this is more a direct instruction approach to skill acquisition. This is founded in motor control theory that was discovered in the 1960s. And it's still an important part, but we need to think about a separate way, which I'm going to talk about in a section. So here we've got optimal movement pattern. There's an optimal movement pattern we believe that exists. So there's a right way to squat. So we're looking for a very specific way to squat. Highly structured learning environments. So we put them in lines and we ask them to squat. We send them to the gym, we ask them to squat. Or we do it on the side of the court in our warm-up and we ask them to squat. Skills are broken down into simplified parts. Right, so it's not actually a squat that's looking like it would on the tennis court. We're actually really simplifying the method, which has its benefits but also has its problems. There's a real internal focus of control. So what that means is that they're thinking about the internal nature of the movement. So where their knees are, where their feet are, where their hips are, and our coaching typically aligns to that via direct feedback. Right? So make sure your knees are out, push your hips back, stand shoulder width apart. And variability in this case is viewed as noise. So we don't want to see any variability in the way that this particular athlete is moving, because we view that as getting in the way of realizing that optimal movement. And it's really prescriptive, right? So 3 sets of 10s of squats. That's how it shows up in the day-to-day experiences of our athletes. But that's not how kids acquire movement skill. That's not where it comes from. We don't put our kids into those types of environments and ask them to move using those really repetitive, structured environments. So this is Benjamin. Now, I'm a movement geek and I look for specific ways of movement when I'm watching young people move, tennis players move, a 65-year-old walking down the street. Like, that's interesting to me. And one of the things we know with movement is that efficient movers have an ability to disassociate their spine from their hips. So what that means is that whenever we're rotating, serving, forehand, backhands, the hips and the spine have to move separately. So hips go and then spine go. So that's how we create torque in order to create power, and it's also how we can maintain safety in the joints, right? So hips and then spine. If we're serving, hips and then spine. So in volleyball, we see a lot of this, or a lot of this, where hips and spines are going at the same time. That stresses the lower back, we get injuries. It also puts stress on the shoulder joint. When Benjamin moves, that disassociating is happening at his hips and then spine. You can see it, hip, spine, hip, spine. Yeah? So that shows up. We're designed to move. And what happens is kids get to 5 and we send them to school and they sit down for long periods of time. They stop moving, they stop exploring, they stop predicting space, they stop predicting gravity. All of these things that if we don't create environments that facilitate this type of movement experience, then they regress. So this is Georgia jumping from one rock to the other. Now what I look for when there's a limb in the air is whether the toe's up or down. So what that indicates is whether there's actually tension up through the hamstring and into the glute in preparation for the foot to hit the ground. Right, so if this foot was down, then we know that there's slack in the system. When they hit the ground, that the ability to control gravity reduces. But when you see 6-year-olds do this, most 6-year-olds, you'll see that that foot is somewhat up. Right, so it's not like a flipper on a seal. So we know that when she hit that left foot comes down, hits the ground, it's going to prepare and control gravity. Same thing in some climbing stuff. So really nice shapes through the back, really good ability to get deep into the hip flexion, and then have this control overhead. Right, in your sport, control overhead is really, really important. Okay, so the brain is a prediction machine. So when it comes to skill, what we need to do is challenge that ability to actually make those predictions of space, of gravity, of others, and of objects. So when it comes to movement, so I set up environments in order to do this constantly. Where this came from was going to some of these sports, parkour, chase tag. If you watched chase tag on YouTube before, it's pretty cool. But these guys have an amazing ability to move. Great movers, can predict space, can predict others, can predict objects, can predict gravity, and they do it almost effortlessly. But what they're doing is constantly having to explore environments. So you won't see these types of athletes in gyms, one, because it's not really in their nature, but two, it's not really what they need. They don't need to be able to squat double body weight. They just need to constantly be able to move in a way that's reactive, fast, explosive, and predicting those different elements. So where does that leave us? So there's this idea of purposeful play. So this is skill acquisition research that's more recent. And this applies, they actually started to do this research in sports like golf and tennis. So what we've done is we've taken these ideas and we've shifted them into movement. So we're more interested in interesting problems, which I'll show you a few in a second. Right, so interesting problems that just guide movement exploration, that develop some of these capacities. The focus of attention is external from the body. Right, so they're not thinking about where their body joints are, they're thinking about solving the problem. And they're self-organising in order to solve that problem. Right, so the body just finds the correct way, running down a hill, jumping off a pool onto a mat, jumping off a rock, in order to solve the problem. If we do it enough, and we do it across as much variability as we can, then we get really good results. There's no right way to move. Now the caveat to that is there is a wrong way to move. Right, so when I'm looking at young people move, oftentimes I'm looking for red flags as opposed to optimal movements. So there is a wrong way to move, and the reason there is because that risk of injury goes up dramatically when things like we get massive knee valgus, where the knee's coming in, dropping right in, or when we don't get that disassociation between the spine and the hips. And the coaching happens, in this case, via analogies and open-ended questions. So we create the problem, and then we let them have a go, they explore it, and then we help them to understand it in a way that makes sense to their stage of development, and analogies are really good for that. And we ask good questions. What do you feel there? What would happen if you tried this? Etc, etc. Great coaching, right? Happens out there on the court as well. So here's some examples of kids solving interesting problems. Love climbing. Climbing's awesome. I'd have all my tennis players climbing because it's amazing for shoulder control, and it's amazing for that disassociation of the spine and the hips, which you're using all the time in the game. Yeah, so like I'm just putting kids into environments, asking them to solve problems. One knee on the box, pick the bucket up. Right, there's lots of climbing here, I'm going to show you some more. So, categories of play. Controlling gravity, all right, predicting gravity. If we want them to predict it, we need to give them opportunities to explore gravity. So this is our beam challenge. We get kids to make their way across the beam, trying to touch a cone with their feet on the way. Always changing the cones, changing the height, changing the width, in order for them to pick up as many experiences of this particular challenge as we can. So I've just got a whole bunch of videos that I'm going to show you. Usually I do this in practice, we get some equipment out and we have a go, but we're constrained with time today. So I'm giving him a stick with a bag that's got some weight in it, and he's just having to control gravity. So I'd give him 2 or 3 reps of this and then I'd give him something else to do. Because what happens is the body adapts to this particular skill challenge really quickly, and then I need to disrupt that because I want to introduce noise in order to challenge him to refocus and resolve the problem. So this is just one where we're making one kneel on an unstable environment and then pick up a little kettlebell. Again, very similar, picking up a bucket with his foot. This is a derivative of the beam challenge where we're just putting the angle of the foot. So if you remember, I'm looking for the foot that comes up when it's off the ground, and what we can do in order to do that is create tension and dorsiflexion, which is knee over toe, when it is on the ground. So one of the red flags that I see in young athletes all of the time is an inability for that knee to track over the second toe with control. And so often you'll see the knee coming in or the knee going out, finding that path of least resistance. And when that happens is that they can't control that gravity in the way that they need to. So we're creating environments where they can explore that. Again, just another example of controlling gravity. So in this case, he's actually trying to get long through the body. So we're getting all sorts of great benefits through core strength by doing little challenges like this. Similar challenge, pushing cones away with a stick, holding a rock. So this girl here had a real inability to disassociate and also an ability to control gravity. So again, just working through those categories. Another little beam challenge. So with this one here, I'm just asking him to get his heel to touch the ground. And as he successfully does that, I'm just lifting the height of the beam. Rolling, super cool. So one of the areas of movement that humans lose is the ability to roll and play on the ground and get low. So we do lots of this type of stuff. Roll-ups to 2 feet to 1 foot, to jumps. So here's the rotation of the spine idea. So that's that ability to disassociate the spine from the hips. And so what he's doing here is he's having to come out into a lunge position and control where that stick is. So there's lots of instability through the hips and the spine. If he has strong hips, and has the ability to move the spine in order to control the instability that the beam creates. This one here is simply standing up from a lying position using a stick to push it into the ground. And as soon as they have to push a stick into the ground, they have to twist. So that's really cool. Climbing, I use this a lot, and some shoulder stability stuff. Because is a 17-year-old footballer. The last category is speed. So the principle here is just move kids fast. Right. So we see a lack of ability to actually move quickly, and simply the reason is that they're not moving quickly enough. So we need to get them to top speed more often. It's really as simple as that. This is just a little speed where we're isolating the ankle. So this is getting a little bit closer to more fitness as opposed to skill, but there's skill in the position of the foot on the ground. Alright, so just finally, what does movement prescription look like? Well, away from the game, you can put them in the gym, and I do that, but for you that's time intensive, it usually comes with an expense, and most kids don't get access to that enough of the time. So what I'm trying to do is educate sports coaches enough and to generate some interest so that you can start applying some of these ideas in your own training, because that's where the magic is really going to lie. If we can do that, then we're going to get massive improvements over time. So purposeful play that as a part of the game, in the warm-ups, in your small-sided games. lots of different opportunities to get what I call movement snacks into sport-specific experiences. So those purposeful play activities and challenges need to challenge gravity, the height of the movement, right? So we need to be up high, we need to be down really low to the ground. The direction of the movement, so there's 3 planes of movement, forward and back, side to side, and round and around. So make sure you're challenging all those 3 directions, and the speed of the movement. Real fast stuff, real slow stuff, everything in between. And then just finally the caveat is make sure you know where your kids are at in terms of their accelerated growth, because we need to prioritise this stuff. A really nice study out of the UK showed that they can reduce injuries by 73% in football, academy football, by just reducing intensity, prioritising some movement during that stage of accelerated growth. So massive. If you want anything else, I'm around. I've also got a podcast, the Athlete Development Show. So feel free to tune in. We talk about all this sort of stuff and much more. Thanks very much.